History as it happens, November 16th, 2021. The endless battle over history.
CRT is not an honest dialogue. It is a tactic that was used by Hitler and the Ku Klux Klan.
Critical race theory is not true, cannot be true.
Come as at least 25 states introduce legislation to limit
critical race theory asserts that the world in America is divided into a racial...
I am a teacher, and yes, critical race theory is in your school.
Critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
What is critical race theory, and what does it have to do with the teaching of American history? A history filled with contradictions that predate the nation's founding. However you define CRT, the ferocious debate penetrating school districts across the country has suddenly made history class the front line in our culture wars. But in a sense, that's nothing new, and that's next as we speak to Eric Foner as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Critical race theory is being shoved down our children's throats and into the ranks of our military.
Over the years, I've read a lot of history. It's just a hobby of mine. I've read dozens of books about slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, but not until the past year or so did I ever hear the words critical race theory. And for good reason. I never took any graduate-level courses on it. I never attended grad school to begin with. So, like many of you, I'm not sure how CRT, seemingly out of nowhere, became one of the defining political and cultural issues of the day. An Associated Press article about this states, critical race theory is a way of thinking about America's history through the lens of racism. Scholars developed it during the 1970s and 80s in response to what they viewed as a lack of racial progress following the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. It centers on the idea that racism is systemic in the nation's institutions and that they function to maintain the dominance of white people in society. Well, that seems like a solid definition of CRT. But the notion it's being taught to school kids is influencing the outcome of elections, as it did in Virginia, as CRT morphs into a catch-all term. Anything parents may object to in their school system touching on the subject of race. You may have caught this video online by The Good Liars, they're a comedy act, where they interviewed a voter in Virginia.
What's the most important issue in the governor's race here in Virginia?
Getting back to the basics of teaching children, not teaching them critical race theory.
And what is critical race theory?
Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because I don't understand it that much, but it's something that what little bit that I know I don't care for.
And what have you heard that you don't?
Well,
that you don't
like? I'm not going to. I don't have that much knowledge on it, but It's something that I don't care for.
Now, that AP article I mentioned before goes on to say there is little to no evidence that critical race theory itself is being taught to K through 12 public school students, though some ideas central to it, such as lingering consequences of slavery, have been. In Greenwich, Connecticut, some middle school students were given a white bias survey that parents viewed as part of the theory. So we shouldn't dismiss out of hand parents' concerns about whatever may be going on in their schools. Our concern here is how this controversy is going to affect the teaching of history. At a time when significant percentages of Americans still say the Civil War was fought over something other than slavery, to name one gap in public knowledge. At a time when our society is trying to reckon with the legacy of structural racism. Jim Crow, the criminal justice system, banks' lending policies, whatever it might be. So whatever you think of CRT, and I admit to not having given it much thought until recently, I hope you'll listen to my conversation with historian Eric Foner with an open mind, because the fight over the past is nothing new. And just a technical note first, because we record our interviews remotely, from time to time there is a glitch we can't avoid. About 30 minutes into our convo, the audio will sound echoey for about 20 seconds, and then it stops. Just want to let you know ahead of time that it's a brief glitch when you reach it. Eric Foner is Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, and he's the author of some of the most important books on the subject we're going to discuss today, including Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877. It won numerous awards, including the Bancroft Prize, and The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, published 11 years ago. That won the Bancroft and Pulitzer Prizes. His scholarship helped overturn what had been the prevailing version of the overthrow of Reconstruction for the better part of a century. Eric Foner, we're delighted to have you back.
Nice to be here to talk to you.
Historians must love it when the importance of history education and civics garners so much attention, but maybe not in this fashion. Before we get into the specifics of CRT, I'm just curious as to what's been going through your mind as you've been watching this nasty fight play out.
Yeah, well, you're right. Of course, on one level, it's gratifying that people are taking the teaching of history seriously, or at least that is to say they think it's important enough to make it into a major political question. The problem is that the discussion is full of so much demagoguery and just complete misinformation. You have to kind of say, well, is this doing something good, or is it further obfuscating what the teaching of history ought to be, how young people should be introduced to the history of our country? So I would say it's not something that most historians feel is actually advancing the cause of historical understanding, which we feel is something very important in a democracy.
So critical race theory, there are a lot of layers to this issue. As you alluded, it's bleeding into any number of other things, and how something no one was really talking about or had even heard of led to a moral panic, influencing the outcome of elections even. So let's peel these layers away one by one. What is critical race theory, according to Eric Foner, or to the founders of it?
I'm not a founder of critical race theory. Critical race theory emerged in law schools. I'm not a lawyer or a law professor. In the late 1980s, 1990s. I don't know, it's an academic methodology for analyzing American institutions and how racial inequality is embedded in many parts of our society, even in institutions or policies that on the face of it don't appear to have anything to do with race. Take the criminal justice system. If you read the laws, they don't say anything about race. How is that embedded into the methods of policing or the ways in which sentencing of criminals is carried out? What are the racial underpinnings of some of these policies and institutions? Now, as I said, this is a graduate field. I mean, it's law schools, it's graduate students. No grade school or high school in the country is teaching critical race theory. The key word here, critical race theory. Is it critical? No. Is it theory? No. The key word is race. This has something to do with race, and that is what is becoming the ammunition for all these mostly Republican advocates who are saying, we don't want critical race theory in our schools. What they're really saying is we don't want teaching about race. We don't want teaching certainly about the history of racism. That is not the way we want our students to be educated about the United States and its history. Here, the word race at least is explicit. The whole argument really is a descendant of what Richard Nixon called the Southern strategy of the late 1960s and the early 1970s, where in the aftermath of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, Nixon kind of realized that Republicans could appeal to white backlash without actually mentioning race. They could talk about law and order, things like that. They could talk about people cheating on welfare payments. It was very clear who they were referring to, but by that point, because of the civil rights revolution, you couldn't just say segregation forever the way George Wallace had done a few years earlier.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
You couldn't just say, hey, we're going to try to put as many black people in jail as we can, the way it was happening in the country in the 1970s. but this is what they call dog whistles or something. It appeals to racism without mentioning racism. But the fact is, have laws and regulations in many states banning teaching of critical race theory. I dare say that none of the legislators who are voting on these things either has any acquaintance with critical race theory or could define it in any way if you ask them what they're talking about. But what they are thinking, you can see in the way in which these laws are drafted. Often they say nothing can be taught that makes people embarrassed or guilty about their race. In other words, that white students should not feel guilty about being white or about the history of racism, which of course is fair enough. No teacher tries to make students feel guilty. That's ridiculous. That's not how you educate people. But the critics feel that whatever critical race theory is, it's trying to talk about racism in a way that makes white students uncomfortable. Yeah, well, maybe it does make white students uncomfortable to hear about race and racism in American history. A good teacher will use that discomfort as an educational tool to open up discussion of various kinds of institutions and how racial assumptions are built into them. So, as I say, there's the political demagoguery that is associated with banning critical race theory. And now I noticed in today's, I guess it was the Washington Post, now laws are also being proposed to ban specific books from schools in various states, including books by Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, that people are not supposed to read that. Now, why Toni Morrison and not a million other writers? Well, Toni Morrison's black. She's a great writer, but she's black, and they don't want people reading books by black people. So at the bottom of this controversy is racism, but it's not overt racism. It's using this as a political weapon to allow people, in a sense, to combat a real understanding of American history without saying, well, the real reason here is we don't want people learning about racial inequality in the United States. So that's a very long-winded answer because the whole debate is misconceived to begin with, and therefore it's not going to come up with very clear, useful answers.
We raised a lot of points there. We'll try to take them on one at a time. I've seen the model legislation that has been adopted in several states or being proposed, and it uses language like teachers shall not compel students to believe certain things. And James Grossman of the AHA, who's been on the podcast, says teachers aren't going around trying to make students believe things, compel teenagers to believe certain things about themselves. It is the critics of CRT, however defined, who would respond to you, Eric Foner. We're not the ones being racist here. We don't want our children being told that they belong to these immutable categories. It's just been very difficult for me to figure out what actually is going on here.
I haven't been in a sixth grade classroom for a long, long time, so I can't tell you what's going on. But I do know that the teaching of American history at all levels has changed enormously since I started out studying history and getting my PhD in history. Issues like race and racism and African American history were never taught. I never had a course in those subjects when I was younger. Now they're taught, absolutely. In the way American history is taught, if you look at American history textbooks or just statewide standards, there's certainly a lot more emphasis on African American history in the United States than there had been in the past. And this makes people uncomfortable. The point is not, again, to identify reasons people should feel guilty. In fact, the whole notion that you're trying to make people feel guilty about their race shows you don't even understand what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is about structures. Nobody in a classroom is saying, hey, you're a white kid, so you're therefore bad. That's ridiculous. If a teacher did that, they should be chucked out. But nobody, to my knowledge, is doing that. And people want, at least the people pushing these issues, want a celebratory history of the United States where we started out perfect and we've been getting better ever since. And things which complicate the story make people uncomfortable. The French writer Ernest Renan once wrote, I always used to present this to my classes on the first day of class in college. Renan wrote, "The historian is the enemy of the nation." The historian is the enemy of the nation. Well, what does he mean by that? What does Renan mean? Is the historian a spy, a traitor? What do you mean an enemy of the nation? Well, eventually somebody figures out what he's saying is nations are built on myths.
Origin
nations
stories.
Nations are built on mythologies, and then the historian comes along and knocks them over. Our job as a historian is to get rid of mythologies and try to get closer to the truth of history. It's an ongoing process. But those who want just a celebration say, well, you're an enemy of the nation, because if we tear down the mythology, well, people will no longer feel as patriotic about America as they should. The problem is a history that is purely celebratory cannot help you understand the present. Part of the importance of history is it sheds light on how we got to where we are in the United States today.
Especially now, right? Because we're going through this reckoning.
How did we get to a situation with so much discussion of race, so much racial tension, so many complaints about inequality of one kind or another? Is that the fault of critical race theory? I doubt it. Do you think all those people demonstrating in Black Lives Matter demonstrations were scholars of critical race theory? I don't really think so. And, some of those laws specifically mention teachers are not allowed to use the phrase or the language systemic racism. They're not allowed to use the term social equity. There's a whole series of terms that are banned from classrooms. Now, any judge in the country is going to say eventually this is a violation of the First Amendment. The government can't tell you what you're allowed to say and not allowed to say.
How are you supposed to teach people about Jim Crow if you can't discuss systemic racism?
You can't talk about anything. How do you deal with the history of slavery at the time of the American Revolution? How do you deal with, Jim Crow, lynching, the overthrow of Reconstruction? That's not the whole of American history. Obviously, there's many other elements of American history which are being taught also. But if you can't talk about racism, it gives people who are uncomfortable an easy answer to saying, well, my child has just come home with a book about Harriet Tubman. I don't want to hear about Harriet Tubman. First of all, Harriet Tubman broke the law, the fugitive slave law. Are we celebrating people who are criminals? Another person might say, well, come on, that's an important part of American history, what Harriet Tubman and people like that did. But if you can stand back and say, no, I'm just condemning critical race theory here, it sort of gives you a more seemingly legitimate position.
And of course, it also becomes a handy political tool. Here's an article from CNBC.com I spotted today. Several business executives and wealthy donors helped fund groups that targeted critical race theory, referring to the elections from last week. One of the groups attacking CRT, the Fight for Schools PAC, Political Action Committee, is based in Virginia and is run by longtime GOP operative Ian Pryor. Welcome to the Parent Revolution, says the group's website. It seems critical race theory has become a catch-all term at this point.
It's a catch-all term, but it has no real meaning in the way it's utilized in these laws and regulations. They don't say, well, here are 10 points that critical race theorists raise that we think ought not to be taught in schools, whatever they are. The only thing they say is students should not feel uncomfortable. What's funny is the right-wing Republicans who, as you say, are funding this, step back a few years and they were all denouncing students who are maybe gay, let's say, or trans or something like that, complaining about feeling uncomfortable in class. Now they're saying, well, white people are made to feel uncomfortable and that's terrible. But previously they said, oh, well, these are snowflakes. Remember, these are snowflakes. They come across ideas which are new to them and they just melt away. They can't deal with it. Let's get your backbone up and be willing to confront new ideas. Fast forward to today, the snowflakes are the white students who supposedly are so petrified by hearing about racism and so put off by it that it'll ruin their educations if anyone mentions the history of racism in the United States.
Yet on the ground and in the classrooms, I suspect that if we were able to clear this clutter out of the way, there'd be a lot of common ground among parents, students, teachers about what's appropriate to teach because, as we've gone over here, some of these ideas that are being debated and kicked around aren't actually entering classrooms.
No, and it's ridiculous. In sixth grade classrooms, they're not learning about the underlying racial implications of things like New Deal housing policy in the 1930s and how redlining affected neighborhoods and segregation. I mean, this is a sophisticated thing. It's not being taught in fifth grade.
Let's get historical now, because I think this issue is, in a way, nothing new. Our past has always been fought over. You alluded to it before. Origin stories, the nation. There may be no better period of U.S. history that exemplifies that problem than the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. How
Right.
What became the prevailing narrative was based not on facts and reality, but more on political or social pressures or imperatives after the Civil War and the South's defeat. So let's talk about the Dunning School and why that is relevant to this discussion. William Dunning, from an institution I understand you are familiar with, Columbia.
Yes, indeed.
Columbia. What was his interpretation of Reconstruction?
Well, what we call the Dunning School, which is books written by Professor Dunning, my predecessor at Columbia long ago, and his students who studied Reconstruction in each of the southern states and wrote books about them. Their attitude was that Reconstruction, that is the period after the Civil War when African Americans were for the first time really granted full democratic rights in this country, and you had biracial democratically elected governments for the first time in American history, that this was the lowest point in the whole saga of American history, because the basic underpinning of their views was that Black people are just incapable of taking part intelligently in democratic processes. And therefore, what followed giving them the right to vote was an orgy of corruption and misgovernment, and that these governments are just the worst in American history. And of course, they were eventually overthrown by the Ku Klux Klan and violent terrorist organizations like that. Dunning was not a Klansman. He didn't approve of people riding around at night assassinating people. But overall, the Klan was seen as a normal or natural reaction to the terrible horrors of Reconstruction. This view of history exemplifies why the study of history is important, and it's important to get it right, because the underlying message was that the white South was perfectly justified in taking basic rights away from African Americans during the Jim Crow period, particularly taking away the right to vote. And whenever the issue was raised in the 20th century, well, what about the Constitution? Remember, 15th Amendment, Black men are supposed to have the right to vote. 14th Amendment, everybody's supposed to be equal before the law. They're certainly not in the South. The white response would be, well, if we do give people back their constitutional rights, you'll just have another replay of the horrors of Reconstruction. So this was not just a view of history, it was part of an ideology of defending Jim Crow. Talking about students being embarrassed, I'm embarrassed when I think that professional historians, the historical profession for several generations, churned out scholarly literature which simply was a support for Jim Crow America, for the Jim Crow system of the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. The historical profession has something to answer for in this country as part of the infrastructure of Jim Crow and racism.
That's right.
I'm not saying that to make white people feel guilty today. There's nobody alive today who was a member of the Dunning School, you know? They're all gone.
He died in the 20s.
So nobody is guilty of this, but the way in which that historical interpretation helped to warp American society is something that we need to be cognizant of.
And just like there are dissenting voices today, there were dissenting voices right from the beginning when Dunning and his fellows were writing this stuff.
Yes, and unfortunately, the dissenting voices were not really part of the mainstream historical profession. These articles and books appeared like in the Journal of Negro History, which was founded in 1916 and published many good articles on Reconstruction. The greatest of the books, of course, criticizing the Dunning School was Black Reconstruction in America by W.E.B. Du Bois, published in 1937, which really took the whole ideology apart and, ended up with a magnificent chapter called The Propaganda of History. Historians were basically propagandists, he argued, for racism. And this is a sad but true critique. But the problem is, that was a time when universities were much, much smaller than they are today, when the number of historians was much, much smaller than it is today. And the historians who did exist outside the black colleges were all white. In my whole career studying history, I never had a black teacher, okay? And that's in the 1950s and 60s. I never had a woman teacher either, by the way, in college or graduate history courses. The profession was a very closed little world of fairly well-to-do white men. It's very different today. One of the reasons we have these debates about history is that the historical profession has changed enormously. Now we have women historians and black historians and Native American historians who are writing the history from a different point of view. They're asking different questions, et cetera, et cetera. So naturally, their picture of history is to be a little bit different than the Dunning School put out around the turn of that past century.
Well, you wrote these words, I guess 1988 is when Reconstruction was published. So maybe you remember them exactly. It required, however, not simply the evolution of scholarship, but a profound change in the nation's politics and racial attitudes to deal the final blow to the Dunning School.
Yeah, well, I guess I did write that.
Yes, you did.
I'm happy to have written it. The point is, the Civil Rights Revolution made the racism underpinning the Dunning School illegitimate. Not only the Civil Rights Revolution, but World War II and the cognizance of the results of Nazi race theory. The idea that one race is superior to another is not just an abstract idea. It had very tragic consequences in World War II, and indeed in our own country with thousands of lynchings, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, changes in the world around you always affect the views of history. On the other hand, there are many people who are put off by changes in the world. I mean, what we're seeing in this debate about history is people who are just not comfortable with what American society is today. We're not in Kansas anymore, as I didn't write that, Wizard of Oz did.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
You know, it's not just a white country anymore, if it ever was. Of course it was, but we are all aware of the diversity of the population today and the growing numbers of non-white people of various origins. This frightens or alarms some people, and the teaching of history becomes a battleground. But in what? In trying to go back to the old society? We're never going to be able to do that. What are we going to do?
Yeah.
Expel all those people who came into the country since 1965?
And no sensible person today is saying that there's been no progress or that race is the only defining concept in American history. And often the debate is framed that way, that it's just two extremes clobbering each other.
There are people who say what you just said. I don't
That's
doubt
true.
that there are people who say all sorts of things about history, left, right, and center. And our job as historians is to try to be as accurate and correct as we can. And if people one might sympathize with on a political basis come out with history that is not defensible, then you have to say that. I mean, that's how historical knowledge advances. Every new theory, every new approach has people, you might say, who go to the edge or go too far or who exaggerate. Eventually, a kind of an equilibrium is reached where the more extreme views get pushed to the side, and yet the insights that have been developed by this new approach, whatever it is, are assimilated then into the mainstream of historical scholarship. And that may well happen with critical race theory, too. Certainly, as I said, there's a lot more attention in the teaching of history to the history of racism and its implications in American history than they used to be. Yeah. Some people find that alarming. I find it positive and truthful. This is what American society has been. Race has been a major factor all the way through from the colonial period on. You cannot deny that and claim to be teaching serious history.
I agree with you, and that's why I said no sensible person would claim it's one extreme or the other.
We seem to be having a dearth of sensible people nowadays.
Well, that's why I also criticize the 1619 Project, because it gets the American Revolution wrong.
It's interesting. A new version, I think, is being published this week or next week of the 1619 Project, a new book based on it, which has, I believe, changed some of the things which were criticized by scholars. By the way, that's how historical knowledge goes forward. Somebody publishes something, it's provocative, it contains mistakes, somebody criticizes it, things move forward. It's a normal process. The thing about the 1619 Project is that so much, even what you just said about the American Revolution, so much of the criticism was about the introductory essay by the journalist, Nicole, who put the whole idea together. It had several historical essays on one issue or another, race and American capitalism, race and the judicial system, also things like that. But all the focus was on one or two sentences in the introduction, which actually had nothing much to do with the rest of the project. So I think people, when it comes to the 1619 Project, need to calm down and read what was actually in there and what is actually in the next version. And many very reputable historians wrote essays for the 1619 Project. So one shouldn't just say the introductory essay with its controversial arguments is the 1619 Project. That's all. I'm not saying that there's no grounds for criticism of it. I'm just saying that everything focused in on one or two sentences. You know, the French have a word which is relevant here, which is problématique. The problématique. A rough translation of that is the question behind the question. What is really being debated here? Is it a sentence about the American Revolution? A rather arcane point about how many colonists thought the British were harboring anti-slavery views, and therefore that contributed to the movement for independence. It's a rather obscure scholarly point, but that's not what the debate is actually about. The problématique is what kind of society is the United States of America? You know, if people say, well, racism is deeply embedded in American society, a lot of people don't want to hear that.
But what I would say in response to that, as a critic of that opening essay, which claims incorrectly that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery.
How do you know it's incorrect? Because there are I'm not saying it's correct now, but to say incorrectly, there are plenty of historians who say that is correct, what she said. Not that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery, but that one of the reasons many Americans went for independence was fear that the British commitment to slavery was not strong enough.
Well, I don't believe that either.
All right, fine. You don't have to believe it, obviously. But I'm just saying, even the way it has come to be part of the debate, that the American Revolution was motivated by a desire to defend slavery, is not actually what she wrote.
Well, based on my own reading on the subject and the available evidence and the arguments made by critics such as Sean Wilentz, who's been on the podcast several times. So while I agree there is a deeper issue here, where I think critics like Sean are correct is not only did the 1619 Project, and we can debate this, of course, get the revolution wrong, but also about the nature of our society. It ignores the anti-slavery impulse early on in American history that went right up to the Civil War. Of course, there were 4 million slaves in the United States by 1860, so we know which side was stronger in that. But there were many white allies of African Americans who tried to end slavery, and the project overlooked them.
You're right. I mean, also that essay said blacks fought alone, which is not true, right? We'll see what the newer version, but my suspicion is it will include discussion of people like William Lloyd Garrison or Wendell Phillips or Thaddeus Stevens and other white Americans who were, on principle, opposed to the institution of slavery.
The 1619 Project has been gone over many, many times, including on my podcast. It's not nearly as bad as the 1776 Project, which is the glorified, idealized.
You know something? I didn't mind the 1776 Project that much. It's ridiculous to begin with. It was announced by President Trump, as you know, just a little bit before the election. Or was it before the inauguration? I can't, but it was sometime in 2020.
It will encourage our educators to teach our children about the miracle of American history.
If you read the 1776 Project, which I have done, which is written by conservatives to counteract 1619, it's not just celebratory. It acknowledges the power of slavery in American life. It acknowledges racism, or puts it at least in the terms that we haven't lived up to these ideals. In other words, to me, it actually showcased how deeply these newer views have actually sunk into the discourse, that even very conservative people feel obligated to pay obeisance to the idea that racism is a big problem in American life and American history. That's in the 1776 Project, weirdly enough, even though one might expect it wouldn't be.
Here's a good place to wrap up, because even before Reconstruction, the survivors of the Confederacy, the lost cause mythologizers, understood that the education system was the key to perpetuating their version of history, in a sense to inculcate future generations in a myth about the war. As James McPherson wrote, children were always present at the unveiling of Confederate monuments, so that the rising generation with no personal memories of the war would understand the heroism of their fathers. The United Daughters of the Confederacy organized children auxiliaries. The daughters and veterans groups formed historian committees, and they, of course, made the textbooks the way they wanted them. And what I'm getting at with all this is that version of history was wrong, but it prevailed for a very long time until scholars like yourself began to overturn it. Maybe the people who are dealing with this issue today see themselves as continuing that work.
I think that what you just said is very correct and revealing, in that these views of history have always been political. Certainly the Daughters of the Confederacy, their view of the whole Civil War era was an effort, A, to glorify the Confederacy, of course, to minimize the importance of slavery, to suggest that Reconstruction was a total failure. And as I said before, all this fed into a defense of the Jim Crow South. You know, those statues were put up right at the time that segregation, disfranchisement were being implemented in the South. They were part of a much bigger system, which included laws, economic discrimination, and violent terrorism against Black people. And this was part of the view of history that went along with that. One hopes that the current debate doesn't somehow contribute to a replay of the backlash against Reconstruction, and more recently now the backlash against the Civil Rights Revolution. But I think the basic takeaway here is history matters. When people think about history matters, it's not just an academic, obscure theory or debate. It affects how our society thinks about itself and how it functions. That's why I said that's the problematique here. How do we look at American society? Yeah. Now, understandably, many people want to say, well, we're a fundamentally good society, fundamentally equal, but with some problems. You know, everybody's got problems. That's not surprising. Then there are those, the critical race theorists, say, no, racism is embedded in our institutions. And it's not just a kind of exception, a problem, a footnote. You can either believe that or not, as you see fit. You know, as I say, the underlying debate is a little bit different than the debate about specific historical questions, like was Reconstruction a success or a failure, things like that.
That's a great way of putting it, problematique, if I said that correctly. So I'll just leave you with one more question, because James Grossman stumped me with this one, so I'll see if I can stump you with it. About the statues, the Lee statue, Stonewall Jackson. The Lee statue in Richmond was put up in 1890, in Charlottesville in the 1920s. Why were there no statues of General Longstreet?
Oh, I know that. I mean, it's in my book in 1988. General Longstreet was one of the few Confederate leaders who became an active Republican during Reconstruction. He became head of the Metropolitan Police Force of New Orleans when that city and state was run by biracial, democratically elected governments. And he supported the basic democratic rights of Black people, the right of Black people to vote. That's what got him out of the pantheon of leaders, not whatever he did in the Civil War. They didn't put up statues of him or failed to put up statues because he wasn't a good general. He was just as good as a lot of other generals, you know. It was because he supported black rights, and therefore he didn't somehow serve the purpose of these statues, which was to justify the taking away of black rights. By the way, it's not just in the South. At Gettysburg, the national park, each state determines whose statues are up. There seems like all sorts of monuments and statues. In fact, I used to work on the museum there at Gettysburg, and one of the guides told me, you know, one of the visitors here asked me, didn't these statues get in the way of the battle? So, you know, but there are a lot of statues there. Each state chooses who's going to be up there. Louisiana never allowed a statue of Longstreet for the same reason I just mentioned. But in the early 20s, maybe 15 years ago or so, the superintendent of the park at Gettysburg said, I'm putting up a statue of Longstreet. I don't care what Louisiana says anymore. Longstreet's a major figure in the battle. It's ridiculous you can't have a statue of him because he supported the rights of blacks. So I'm putting up a statue, and now there is a statue of Longstreet for the first time at Gettysburg.
That's great. I didn't know that. Well, yeah, I think it was Longstreet who disagreed with Lee about Pickett's charge.
Yeah, if Lee had listened to Longstreet, he might not have sent Pickett's charge against the entrenched federal forces and lost the Battle of Gettysburg. Longstreet said, this is not a very good idea.
I'll share with you a crazy story, too, along the lines of the statues getting in the way of the battle. A few years ago, when I was working as a local reporter here in Washington, I did a feature about underground railroad sites.
Yes.
I went to what was a plantation in Maryland, which was a slave state right to the end, as we know. Did not secede, but was a slave state. And the tour guide at the state park told me that one of the most common questions she gets when people are there to visit underground railroad sites is, where are the tracks?
Well, they might have read Colston Whitehead's novel, which is a novel, folks. It's not history. It's a great book. I love it, but it's not history. I mean, it knows history, but they have real tracks. Most underground railroad sites do not have actual tracks, that's for sure.
That would have been something.
Although it is fair enough that in the 1840s and 50s, as the railroad was being built in this country, escaping slaves used it to get out of the South. How did Frederick Douglass get out of Maryland to New York? On a train. That was just a regular train. It wasn't the Underground Railroad. But nonetheless, it was a lot quicker hopping on a train and getting to the north than running through the fields and hiding at night, you know, as many people have done. So maybe there's a little modicum of truth in there.
Yeah, maybe I was being a little too tough, but yeah, there was no subway in the 1840s.
No, there wasn't.
That would have been something.
That's the problem with what we do, we call internet research. If you wanted to go, I wrote a book on the Underground Railroad, so I try to do this. You go on ProQuest historical newspapers and you can search for Underground Railroad, and you get all sorts of articles from all over the place right on your computer screen. It's great. Unfortunately, when you type it in there, you get the building of the London subway system, basically, for Underground Railroad. So it doesn't help you much with that kind of research.
Well, Eric Foner, that'll be the last time I attempt to stump you on anything Civil War related. Of course you knew the answer. And to our listeners, a final word about the 1619 Project. Check out Sean Willentz's recent essay about its problems pertaining to the American Revolution and the nature of our society more broadly. The essay is titled The 1619 Project and Living in the Truth. Google it, and Sean Willentz is actually going to be back on the podcast in a few weeks. On the next episode of History as It Happens, King George III wasn't mad, and he really wasn't all that bad, says Andrew Roberts. We're going to speak to the acclaimed biographer about America's last king and some of our founding myths next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.